the jewel of the Dutch colonial empire, once famous for the riches of the Spice Islands and now coveted by the Japanese Empire because of its valuable natural resources, most notably oil, rubber and tin, the Dutch East Indies would become a deadly and particular battlefield during World War II, characterized by its rugged and challenging terrains and by the wide variety of offensive operations carried out by the invaders. From the dense forests of Borneo to the mountainous terrains of Sumatra, from the smallest island in the Moluccas to the heart of Dutch rule in Java, the Japanese would fight and win against the combined strength of the American, British, Dutch and Australian forces that resisted them. Like a ferocious storm, they came with a resolute mind to break the shackles imposed by the West and secure an important lifeline for their empire, to fight in a campaign that has it all: deadly amphibious assaults, savage land battles, fierce air combat, impressive naval engagements, and even daring airborne attacks. Thus, join us as we cover all of this and more in our special episode for the Dutch East Indies campaign. This video is sponsored by you. Unfortunately, the YouTube environment is not great right now, with the algorithm being friendlier to drama and react channels and YouTube being permissive of AI slop. We don't do drama and we don't do AI, but thanks to our members and patrons, our channel continues to make 3 public videos per week, with the team intact and going strong. In recognition of their generosity and contributions, members and patrons receive 2 additional exclusive videos each week, and access many other perks. Join them to watch more than 250 exclusive videos covering every era of history by pressing the join button under the video or the links in the description and pinned comment. The Dutch East Indies, probably the most important objective of the Japanese because of its richness in petroleum oil, rubber, nickel, tin, scrap iron and other strategic resources, covered a wide area with long distances for the different Japanese task forces to travel. This is why Japan didn't plan to attack the Indies straight away. Instead, they had planned to first secure footholds on Malaya, the Philippines and British Borneo, so that they could then launch multiple subsequent attacks against critical locations in the Indies, most importantly their oil fields. The Dutch, meanwhile, had seen their homeland invaded and occupied by Nazi Germany back in May of 1940. Queen Wilhelmina and the Dutch government had managed to escape to London by May 13th, where they established a government in exile. But despite this, they were now unable to defend their colonial possessions in the east. There, the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army of Lieutenant General Hein ter Poorten tried to modernize as fast as possible in view of a possible Japanese invasion. By December of 1941, the army had grown to 85,000 personnel, albeit inadequately equipped and poorly trained. Ter Poorten also counted with a sizable air force, although the 389 aircraft they had were old and decisively outclassed by superior Japanese planes. In the Kalimantan area of Borneo, the Dutch had 2 important western airfields that were unknown to the Japanese, from which they could conduct air operations against the enemy. They also had strong garrisons in all major cities of Dutch Borneo, although they would not see fighting this week. The ones that would see fighting would be the defenders in British Borneo. This area was not only important for the Japanese to act as a stepping stone for the invasion of the Dutch East Indies, but it also had valuable oil fields in Miri and Seria, which made them huge objectives. Marshal Brooke Popham had assigned the 2nd Battalion of the 15th Punjab Regiment to defend the cities of Kuching and Miri, while the local rulers of Sarawak organised a paramilitary force, the Sarawak Rangers, defending the rest of the province. These forces were then grouped into the Sarawak Force, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Lane. The Japanese plan consisted of an initial attack against Miri and Seria, with the objective of securing their oil fields, followed by a main amphibious assault against Kuching and the nearby airfields. This operation would be carried out by the Kawaguchi Detachment, mainly composed of the 35th Brigade of the 124th Infantry Regiment, under the command of Major General Kawaguchi Kiyotake. They would also be escorted and supported by a small fleet under Rear Admiral Kurita Takeo, consisting of 3 cruisers, 6 destroyers, and 746 SNLF Marines. On December 13th, the Kawaguchi detachment left Cam Ranh Bay in 10 transport ships, heading to British Borneo.
On December 16th, 2 detachments of the 56th Division completed preparations to conduct amphibious invasions on Davao and the Sulu Islands, intending to secure a southern airfield on the Philippines and to prepare further attacks on Borneo from Jolo.
The detachments were under the general command of Major General Sakaguchi Shizuo, and they would depart Palau en route to Davao later that day. Meanwhile, in Borneo, the main body of the Kawaguchi detachment successfully landed on Miri and Seria in the early hours of December 16th. They were met with little resistance, and thus could occupy their oil fields and airfields with ease. SNLF Marines also landed on the coast near Lutong, and managed to occupy its important oil refinery. Immediately, the Japanese would start working on restoring the captured oil fields, while Kawaguchi prepared his forces for their main assault on Kuching, which we'll cover next week. The following day, however, Dutch reconnaissance from Singkawang learned about the Japanese invasion and then launched an air attack over Miri, although it was unsuccessful. On December 17th, the Japanese were also hit by the Chengpu earthquake, which caused considerable damage in Taiwan. It seems Japan was fighting even nature itself at this point. Meanwhile, in Miri, the invaders were subjected to 2 more Dutch air attacks in the last 2 days, which would fail to inflict heavy damage on the Japanese, although one of the Dutch flying boats would successfully manage to sink the destroyer Shinonome, killing its 228 crew. This week would also end with a terrible outcome for the American defenders in the Philippines. On Davao, the Sakaguchi and Miura detachments finally landed under the cover of night. The city defenders, consisting of a single regiment of the Philippine 101st Division, were taken completely by surprise, yet they offered as much resistance as they could. With the Miura detachment suffering many casualties, General Sakaguchi was forced to order forward some of his forces reserved for the attack on the Sulu Islands. Together, these forces would storm and take the city by midday, and a final attack would then be carried out against the remaining Filipino defenders behind the Davao River, finally forcing them to retreat northwestwards. Upon reaching Davao, the Japanese soldiers would be cheered by the sizable Japanese population of the city, liberating them from the warehouses in which they had been detained at the start of the war. While the battered Miura detachment stayed to garrison Davao and continued the liberation of Japanese inhabitants, the Sakaguchi detachment would prepare to continue onwards towards Jolo on the Sulu Islands, and then to Tarakan in Dutch Borneo. The following day, General Kawaguchi and 2 battalions of his detachment departed Miri en route to Kuching, where Colonel Lane was actually preparing to retreat southwest towards Dutch Borneo. To cover the convoys, the Japanese also bombarded the Singkawang airfield, forcing the Dutch to move their aircraft to Sumatra. Despite their efforts though, Kawaguchi's convoy would be discovered by Dutch submarines, who then started to prey upon their victims.
December 23rd would see the Dutch attack by 2 submarines, the K-14 and K-16, on the Japanese convoys en route to Kuching, which managed to sink 2 troop transports and 1 destroyer.
On Christmas Eve, Kawaguchi's attack on Kuching began early in the morning, landing at the mouth of the Santubong River. The British defenders offered fierce resistance, but in the end, Colonel Lane decided the following day to retreat through the jungles towards Dutch West Borneo. December 25th would also see the invasion of Jolo in the Sulu Islands, with General Sakaguchi departing Davao back on December 23rd. Upon arriving to his destination, one of his battalions landed at Jolo and captured the city and the airfield, facing slight resistance from the local inhabitants. Now, Sakaguchi had his main base ready to conduct operations against Dutch Borneo. On December 28th, upon returning back to Miri from his attack on Kuching, General Kawaguchi ordered the battalion-strong Watanabe force to advance and then capture Brunei, with the objective of acquiring small boats for an attack on North Borneo. 3 days later, the Watanabe force carried out their orders, but found all big ships in Brunei's harbour already destroyed by the British defenders. This forced Kawaguchi to employ only small fishing boats for his next attacks. After taking Labuan Island on January 1st, Kawaguchi decided to launch his main attack on North Borneo. On January 8th, 2 infantry platoons occupied the towns of Jesselton and Beaufort, while the Watanabe force captured Sandakan, the seat of government of North Borneo, then rescuing some 600 interned Japanese citizens. Kawaguchi's men would then continue their advance throughout British Borneo, with Governor Robert Smith finally surrendering on January 19th. Meanwhile, the Watanabe force captured Tawau on January 24th and Lahad Datu on January 31st, freeing up a further 1,500 interned Japanese citizens. During the talks of the Arcadia Conference, the Allied governments had agreed to form a joint command and an integrated staff for the Pacific War, the American, British, Dutch, Australian Command, or ABDACOM for short. It was to be responsible for the defence of the vast area that ranged from Burma to northwestern Australia, and for the maintenance of the Malay Barrier, a line running down the Malayan Peninsula through the southernmost islands of the Dutch East Indies. British General Sir Archibald Wavell was the man appointed as Supreme Commander of ABDACOM, with Dutch General Hein te Potten as Commander of the Land Forces, British Air Marshal Sir Richard Pearse as Commander of Air Forces, and American Admiral Thomas Hart as Commander of Naval Forces. The year of 1942 didn't start as a normal and regular year for the Dutch. Their homeland, ravaged by war, was under the occupation of enemy Germans. Their government and their queen were in exile, helping the Allies in any manner they could, and their most important colony had become a target for Japanese expansion. But this colony was not defenseless at all, as Lieutenant General Hein te Potten counted with around 85,000 soldiers, with most of them concentrated at the island of Java. The Dutch also counted with a sizable naval force of 5 cruisers, 8 destroyers, 12 submarines, and 56 other ships, under the command of Lieutenant Admiral Conrad Helfrich, nicknamed Ship-a-Day Helfrich because he sank more Japanese ships in the first weeks of the war than the entire British or American navies together. It's worth mentioning that Helfrich's small force of submarines was a formidable opponent for the Japanese Navy, sinking several of their ships, as we've seen in the previous weeks. Dutch air power was an important threat as well, having around 500 aircraft at their disposal, from which some 300 were front-line aircraft. These were based on several secret airfields scattered around the East Indies, such as Samarinda II or Singkawang II, to where Dutch planes would be transferred in case of war, trying to prevent their destruction by a Japanese air attack. These airfields were, however, quickly discovered by the invaders, then becoming vital strategic objectives and easy prey for Japanese bombers. For the invasion of the Dutch East Indies, the Japanese plan stipulated that they first needed to secure footholds on Malaya and the Philippines. After this was achieved, the Japanese would then launch an amphibious invasion of Borneo, making it the stepping stone from which to launch the invasion of the East Indies. Absolute coordination was essential for this operation, especially since the Indies were the most important target of the Japanese offensives due to its richness in petroleum oil, rubber, nickel, tin, scrap iron, and other strategic resources. The 16th Army, under Lieutenant General Imamura Hitoshi, was appointed by the commander of the Southern Expeditionary Army Group, General Hisaichi Terauchi, to carry out the invasion of the East Indies, supported by the 3rd Air Force once their operations in Malaya had concluded. Originally, this army was composed of the 2nd Division and the Sakaguchi Detachment, which took part in the conquests of Davao and Jolo, but Tokyo had also already planned for the 38th and 48th Divisions, as well as the South Seas Detachment and many other units, to be assigned to the 16th Army, as the capture of Hong Kong, the Philippines, Malaya, Guam, and Rabaul progressed. Initially supporting the invasion of the Philippines, the 3rd Fleet of Admiral Takahashi and its 11th Air Fleet were also appointed to support the Dutch East Indies campaign. The plan for the 16th Army was to launch a series of naval invasions against key points in the Dutch East Indies, namely some of the secret airfields that we've discussed, as the Japanese would need air support from these points for their planned invasion of Java. This plan, drafted by the leading commanders of the 3rd Fleet, was very specific about where and when each unit would carry out the invasion operations. After securing Davao and Jolo, the Sekiguchi detachment would land on Tarakan Island around the 33rd day after the start of the war, then launching an invasion of Balikpapan 10 days later. Once Balikpapan was in Japanese hands, General Sekiguchi would naval invade Banjarmasin around the 53rd day, before finally landing on Bali some 16 days later. Meanwhile, after taking Hong Kong, 2 battalions of the 38th Division would assemble in Palau to seize Ambon and then attack Kupang on Timor Island, while the rest of the division would be appointed to launch the invasion of southern Sumatra. Finally, the main force of this army would execute the invasion of the island of Java. The 2nd Division would be responsible for the landings in Western Java, while the 48th Division would take charge of the invasion of Eastern Java. The 3rd Fleet's Sasebo force of SNLF Marines and Yokosuka force of paratroopers would also be responsible for the subsequent capture of Manado, Kendari, and Makassar in the Celebes, while also assisting in the operations against Timor.
By January 3rd, with the rapid advances on the Malayan and Philippine fronts, and the successful capture of British Borneo, the Japanese command finally felt ready to begin the Dutch East Indies campaign.
On January 6th, Takahashi's fleet arrived in Davao, where the Sekiguchi detachment had already concentrated. The following day, the invasion force departed Malalag Bay, heading towards Tarakan Island in Dutch Borneo. They were escorted by a fleet consisting of 9 destroyers and a light cruiser, under the command of Rear Admiral Nishimura Shoji. Meanwhile, the Dutch had a garrison of around 1,400 men in Tarakan, led by Lieutenant Colonel Simon de Waal. This force had prepared defensive positions, expecting a Japanese attack to the west, yet they were to be surprised. On January 10th, Dutch reconnaissance detected the Japanese convoy en route to Tarakan, so de Waal ordered the destruction of all oil installations on the island. He also sent some bombers to disrupt the landings, but to no avail, as by the early hours of January 11th, after the official declaration of war on the Netherlands, some SNLF Marines and Sekiguchi's main force had already landed north of the Amal River. They then marched south to the mouth of the river under a burning red sky, where they stormed and outflanked some Dutch pillboxes. A battalion of the Sekiguchi detachment also landed further south at Tanjuang Bato to capture the Linkas oil fields. This unit tried to advance through the jungle, but was slowed down by the extremely dense vegetation. Sekiguchi also lost communications with them, so the Japanese general didn't know of their whereabouts. At the same time, aided by a Japanese guide who knew the area, Sekiguchi's main force broke through the jungle and got to the north side of the Tarakan oil field by midday. As the Japanese advanced north of the Tarakan oil field, the Dutch bombarded them with artillery and mortars far from Saraba's support point. The Dutch and Japanese made several simultaneous offensives against each other, but eventually the Japanese landed a series of night raids, and Yamamoto's troops managed to capture both lines of Dutch barracks. The defenders had also lost many men, and their communications with the coastal batteries were breaking down. This left de Waal with no choice but to capitulate on the morning of January 12th. Yet without communications, some Dutch units were still fighting on. One of these units was the Karuengan Battery, which came into contact with the Japanese battalion that had lost communications around noon. Yet despite the sustained attack, the Karuengan Battery accurately shot and sunk 2 Japanese minesweepers and 1 landing craft. The battery was finally captured on January 13th, subjected to the Japanese's vengeance for the loss of their minesweepers, who then executed most of its crew. Sekiguchi had lost only 7 men in the entire battle, while the IJN lost around 250 men, mainly in the destroyed minesweepers. In contrast, the Dutch lost around 300 men, with the rest ending up captured. the same day that the Sekiguchi detachment was landing on Tarakan, Rear Admiral Takagi Takeo started the IJN operation in the Celebes. An invasion fleet under Rear Admiral Tanaka Raizo, consisting of 3 cruisers and 11 destroyers, escorted the Sasebo force, consisting of 3,200 SNLF Marines, while some 762 paratroopers from the Yokosuka force prepared to be dropped onto the Langoan airfield. The main force of Sasebo would land around Manado to envelop the Dutch defenders and capture the town, with another force of 1,400 SNLF Marines also landing at Kema to help the paratroopers secure the airfield. In the Celebes, Colonel Marinus Voren had substantial forces under his command, spread across 3 major areas: Manado, Kendari, and Makassar. Manado was defended by around 1,500 men, under Major Ben Schilmuller, mainly from the National Reserve Battalion. In the early morning of January 11th, the Sasebo force came ashore at Manado and Kume, repulsing a small number of Dutch units and heading towards the Langoan airfield. A couple of hours later, the Yokosuka force was dropped on Langoan, where the paratroopers managed to completely seize the airfield. In response to the strong Japanese attack, the defenders retreated to Timor, where they were finally crushed by the SNLF Marines by noon. With the fall of Manado, Tomahon, and Tondano, Schilmuller had decided by night to retreat with most of his forces to the west, towards Amurang, where he would commence guerrilla warfare. The following day, the Japanese parachuted a company of reinforcements to Manado. Soon all the Japanese forces made contact at Langoan and captured the city. With Schilmuller's retreat, some scattered Dutch units also started to wage guerrilla warfare, so the Dutch formed in total 5 guerrilla groups operating separately. This paratroop operation at Manado was the first ever carried out by Japanese forces, and it was a complete success. The Sasebo force would finally remain in Manado until January 16th to carry out mopping up operations, although most of the guerrilla groups would manage to escape them. The successful capture of Tarakan and Manado signified the start of the Dutch East Indies campaign, and this was something that deeply concerned the ABDA command. After conducting mopping up operations in Tarakan and Manado, the Japanese forces prepared to launch simultaneous attacks on Balikpapan and Kendari by the end of this week. Reinforced by units from Jolo, the Sekiguchi detachment departed Tarakan on January 21st, supported by Admiral Nishimura's fleet. Their plan was to have a battalion-sized unit secretly ascend the Wain River in front of the city of Balikpapan to advance deep into the rear of the city so that it could take control of its weak points in a swift surprise attack. Meanwhile, the Dutch garrison of Balikpapan numbered some 1,100 men, mainly from the 6th Battalion, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Cornelis van den Hogenband. On January 18th, alerted of an incoming Japanese attack, the Dutch commander ordered the destruction of all oil installations in Balikpapan, trying to prevent their full employment by the enemy. On January 22nd, the Japanese invasion fleet was sighted by an American PBY, so the Dutch sent some Martin B-10 bombers and 12 F-2A Brewster Buffaloes to escort to attack the convoy, as well as some of their submarines. Despite sinking the Nanamaru transport ship and damaging others while losing a single B-10, they could not prevent the landings of the Sekiguchi detachment by the early hours of January 24th. Without meeting any resistance, the main force of the Sekiguchi detachment quickly seized the Dutch airfield and then continued on towards Balikpapan. At the same time, an American task force sent by Admiral Hart was approaching the vicinity of the Dutch city. This task force, consisting of 4 destroyers, under the command of Rear Admiral William Glassford and Commander Paul Talbot, launched a strong attack against 12 Japanese transport ships, sinking 4 transports and damaging many more vessels. In return, 2 of the American destroyers only suffered light damage before retreating back to the sea. In the meantime, the surprise unit got to the mouth of the Wain River by early morning, beginning their ascent up the river. On the morning of January 25th, these soldiers got to the rear of the city, while the main force of the detachment reached the northern outskirts of Balikpapan. The Dutch garrison had been taken completely by surprise, and by midday, the surprise unit advanced into Batu Ampar and defeated Hergenband's forces in battle. They would then join with the rest of the detachment to enter into the city of Balikpapan and capture the whole urban area. Mopping up operations began the next day, aimed against the town of Samarinda, while a battalion-sized detachment under Lieutenant Colonel Kume Motozo was created to seize the oil fields at Sanga Sanga. Simultaneous to the Battle of Balikpapan, Admiral Takagi's forces had left Bangka on January 21st, launching their attack on Kendari 3 days later. With the landings of the Sasebo force by early morning, the small Dutch garrison of 400 soldiers was caught off guard and had to retreat to Mandongan after destroying as much of the Kendari II airfield as possible. Kendari and its airfield then fell by midday, while the Dutch forces retreated further back to Tawanga on the Konaweha River, from where they would start to execute guerrilla warfare. Due to intense rain making visibility poor, the next morning a happy accident happened for the Allies, as the destroyer Hatsuharu collided with the cruiser Nagara. The collision left them both with severe damage, so they had to sail back to Davao for repairs. Yet by January 25th, with the fall of Balikpapan and Kendari, the Japanese had achieved their next step in their plan of invasion for the Dutch East Indies, getting slowly but surely ever closer to the island of Java. Since the fall of Kuching, the remnants of the Punjabi battalion that were sent to defend British Borneo had retreated to the airfield of Singkawang II, joining a garrison of 750 Dutch soldiers. There, Colonel Lane placed his battalion under Dutch command for the defense of the airfield, while the Japanese forces of the Kawaguchi detachment prepared to execute a land-based attack from the north and a coastal assault from the west. On January 24th, this attack finally came to fruition, as 5 Japanese companies crossed the border and started their advance on Singkawang. The following day, they had reached a village northeast of the airfield, where Colonel Lane decided to launch a swift counterattack on January 26th. Yet this attack was repulsed, and by night, the Japanese had launched a strong assault that had turned the flanks of the defenders. With the battle lost, the Allies started the evacuation of Singkawang II airfield on January 27th, with a VCL light tank and a Brat Overwelgen covering their retreat at the crossroads between the towns of Ledo and Sengao, thus inflicting heavy casualties on the invaders. Although the Overwelgen managed to retreat to Ledo with only pierced tires, the tank had to be abandoned and was later captured by Japanese soldiers. Yet despite their valiant efforts, they could not prevent 2 Punjabi platoons from getting surrounded and annihilated. By the evening of January 27th, though, most of the defenders would reach Ledo and would establish new defensive positions there. Yet at the same time, the Japanese forces would land at Pemangkat, capturing several coastal towns to the south and getting close to Bengkajang, thus threatening to surround the Allied forces at Ledo. This forced the defenders to retreat further east to Sangao and Sintang, then fighting a series of rearguard actions until January 31st, when the Allied forces would finally decide to pull back to the south coast of Borneo, where they would start to fight guerrilla warfare. And on the other side of the island, the Kume detachment had crossed the Duandang River by January 29th, getting very close to the oil fields of Sanga Sanga. Back on January 24th, some 300 Dutch soldiers under Captain Montero had started the demolition of such oil fields, leaving behind 80 men to delay the Japanese advance, while Montero retreated towards the town of Samarinda. These 80 men were then engaged by the Kume detachment, getting completely pummeled and retreating in disarray towards Lower Jinan. After the fall of Sanga Sanga, Montero decided to raise Samarinda and move his headquarters to Lower Jinan by January 31st, where he was planning to execute a long-term delaying action of the Japanese advance along the Mahakam River towards the Samarinda II airfield. But this week would also see the launch of a very important operation within the Dutch East Indies campaign, the invasion of Ambon. Ambon Island had always been the political, economic, and military center of the Moluccas, so it was natural that it held strategic importance for the Japanese. 2 battalions of the 38th Division, under Major General Ito Tekio, were appointed to carry out the Ambon operation, later reinforced with an additional battalion prior to the start of the invasion. The Eastern Detachment would be supported by an important fleet, primarily consisting of 2 cruisers and 14 destroyers, led by Rear Admiral Takagi Takeo. The Japanese planned to land on the east coast of the southern peninsula of Ambon, where the Allied defences were considered weak, so that the invaders could catch and destroy the main force of the defenders and promptly seize the strategic points of the island. Furthermore, Takagi also planned to land a regiment of SNLF Marines to capture the Laha airfield. Meanwhile, the Dutch countered with the Moluccan Brigade of Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Capitz, totaling some 2,600 men, and on December 17th they had been further reinforced by the Gull Force, consisting of around 1,100 Australian soldiers under Lieutenant Colonel William Scott. They had started to suffer heavy bombardment by Japanese aircraft since January 24th, in preparation for the invasion to come.
3 days later, the Eastern Detachment departed Davao, heading towards Ambon, and on January 30th, the invasion convoy was discovered by a Brewster Buffalo fighter, although no air attacks were conducted. By nightfall, the convoy had entered the Hitulama anchorage, and on the early morning of January 31st, the Eastern Detachment began to land on the shores of Ambon. Following the landing, Ito ordered his men to push ahead and advance towards the city of Ambon across the steep mountains. Thus, a Japanese battalion quickly took the strong positions near Paso and Batugong and then advanced towards Ambon and Halong by February 1st, while the rest of the detachment, aided by air and artillery support, overran the Dutch forces on the coast and advanced directly on Ambon in 2 columns. With most of his defences designed to repel attacks from the north and west, Capitz could do nothing to help his desperately retreating forces. Furthermore, at noon on January 31st, the Allied communications were cut, so Capitz could not communicate with the 400 Australian defenders at Laha, which were being attacked by SNLF Marines. On the early morning of February 1st, the Japanese would finally consolidate at Paso, and Ito would manage to capture Ambon at last, forcing Capitz and some 800 Dutch soldiers to surrender at Halong. But the Australians kept fighting on, successfully repelling the Japanese invaders at Laha and on the Nona Plateau. Following the events of the last couple of weeks, General Sakaguchi and his detachment had achieved their second milestone in the Dutch East Indies operation, the conquest of Balikpapan. While the Kume detachment was mopping up the area, he was now preparing to launch the invasion of Banjarmasin in conjunction with a naval strike force. But back on January 28th, it was finally decided that he would receive no support from the IJN, and that his main forces would be appointed to support the invasion of Java. He then formed a strong unit under Colonel Yamamoto Kyohei, built around the main strength of the 146th Regiment. The plan for this unit was to rapidly advance towards the city of Banjarmasin after going ashore at Tanagrogat, while a small element of the unit, under Captain Okamoto Yoshibumi, maneuvered along the coast in small boats to land in the southern area of the city and capture the Martapura airfield. On the night of January 30th, the Okamoto unit sailed from Balikpapan and started its advance southwards. The following morning, the Yamamoto unit also departed Balikpapan and reached Adang Bay by the night of the same day. After landing, the Yamamoto unit quickly seized the town of Tanagrogot on February 1st, but the 60 Dutch soldiers of the local garrison had burnt the town before retreating. This began the widespread native support for the invaders, and culminated with many desertions on the side of the Dutch. By February 3rd, all of the Japanese forces under Yamamoto had concentrated on Tanagrogot, finally starting their overland trek towards Banjarmasin. At this point, Japanese forces were also very close to capturing the important town of Samarinda. From Lower Jinan,
Captain Montero had been tasked with delaying as much as he could the Japanese advance towards the important Samarinda II airfield. But his mission was a very difficult one, especially since he wasn't allowed to launch any counterattack. Furthermore, the Kume detachment had already captured the oil fields at Sanga, and the Japanese were now ready to continue their advance against the town of Samarinda. Only Montero's men stood in their way. On February 2nd, though, Dutch forces discovered that another Japanese column was advancing from Balikpapan towards Mentawai, forcing Montero to move again his headquarters, this time to the town of Tenggarong. But Colonel Kume was also hot on the heels of the Dutch defenders, capturing Luojinan and Samarinda by February 3rd and putting much pressure on Montero's forces. From Tenggarong, the Dutch soldiers would continue to offer resistance until February 8th, when the Japanese forces managed to take the town. By February 15th, though, Montero had established new defensive positions at the towns of Benoa Baroe and Kotabangoan, from where he would continue to delay the advance of the Kume detachment until early March. Although the Samarinda II airfield was an important objective of the Japanese, who wanted to secure air superiority for when they launched their invasion of Java, time would eventually tell that it was not needed, as we'll see in the future. Back to Banjarmasin, Yamamoto faced an important problem. There were no roads or bridges in the jungle-covered mountain ranges, making their advance towards Banjarmasin very difficult. Furthermore, as they clambered up steep mountains, they also had to fend against swarms of mosquitoes, land leeches, and other insects. Yet by February 4th, the Japanese had reached the town of Moiara Aweja, successfully repulsing a small Dutch army, but failing to quickly pursue them towards Matapura. In response, the Dutch executed a scorched earth tactic, causing enormous distraction in the towns east of the Barito River. By February 7th, reinforced by 2 brigades, the defenders also tried to make a stand at Kandangan, but they ended up retreating to some more solid defensive positions at Matapura. At this point, they had destroyed most of the airfields and oil fields in the area to prevent their employment by the enemy, with the evacuation of Banjarmasin also well underway. The Okamoto unit had also captured the port of Kotabaroe on the northern end of Laut Island on February 7th, then continuing southwards and landing on Banjarmasin the next day, trying to cut off the defenders' escape. Yet by February 9th, some Dutch forces had already left East Borneo in boats, heading west towards Kotawaringin and leaving only a small number of men at the Oalin airfield. The following morning, an advance party of the Yamamoto unit finally came out of the jungles and defeated the small Dutch resistance, capturing Matapura with the aid of the indigenous people. That same day, the Okamoto unit also arrived and captured the Oalin airfield, completing the conquest of Banjarmasin. Meanwhile, in Ambon, the Eastern Detachment continued their conquest of the island. General Ito had successfully captured the town of Ambon by February 1st, forcing the main Dutch force under Commander Capitz to surrender, and sent notes to the Australian commandos and Dutch soldiers under Lieutenant Colonel Scott to do the same. This message was lost, and the Australians fought on for 2 more days. With Ambon and the northern side of the peninsula secured, Ito then sent his main forces to defeat the stubborn Australian commandos to the south, but they could only establish a foothold on the Nona Plateau due to the strong Australian resistance. On February 2nd, SNLF Marines would launch a strong charge against the Laha airfield, but the attack made little progress and they suffered many casualties in return. In the meantime, however, a small Japanese force that had gone through the jungles into the highlands north of Laha defeated dozens of enemy troops and prepared to launch a surprise attack on the airfield. The following day, this attack was launched into the rear of the surprised Australians, quickly overwhelming their defences and forcing them to surrender. That same day, the main units of the Eastern Detachment captured an important highland in the centre of the Nona Plateau, getting very close to the southern tip of the peninsula and finally forcing the rest of the Australian commandos and Dutch defenders to surrender. With Ambon now firmly in Japanese hands, Ito would command mopping up operations for the next 2 days, then starting to prepare for the invasion of the island of Timor. Turning back to the Dutch East Indies, the staff of the ABDACOM was very worried about the rapid progress of the Japanese advance through the Pacific. The main naval base of the Allied command, based at Surabaya, was within range of Japanese aircraft since the fall of Kendari, sustaining a heavy pummeling on a daily basis, and the battered naval forces of Admiral Hart were definitely outnumbered in the Pacific. Yet their bold raid on Balikpapan during the start of the battle had a very promising outcome, so Hart decided to form the ABDA Striking Force, initially consisting of several American and Dutch warships, led by Dutch Rear Admiral Karel Doorman. By February 3rd, the Allied forces had gathered east of Surabaya, then preparing to sortie the following night to head through the Flores Sea towards the Makassar Strait, where they had learned that the IJN was going to carry out a landing operation. Hart's surprise attack was actually very risky, because the Allied fleet had to transit during daylight, where they could be easily discovered. Furthermore, Japanese bombers had already sighted them during one of their daily raids, so the element of surprise was already lost. During the morning of February 4th, Japanese airmen from Kendari finally pinpointed the exact location of Doorman's forces near the Kangean Islands, so Rear Admiral Sukahara Nishizo of the 11th Air Fleet launched 36 G4M and 24 G3M bombers to get them. From the get-go, the Japanese aviators went for the Allied cruisers, dropping bombs over the Marblehead and the Houston. Although the Houston skillfully evaded all bombs, the Marblehead was hit hard on the quarterdeck, suffering heavy damage. The final attacks were then launched against the Houston and the De Ruyter, with all of the bombs missing except for the last one. This scored a devastating hit over the Houston, causing severe damage on the American cruiser. By midday, Doorman realized that his forces were in great peril, so he started to retreat west back to Surabaya. The first operation of the ABDA Striking Force had ended in a fiasco, but at least they hadn't suffered any sunk ships. Meanwhile, with the mopping up of Ambon finally completed, the Japanese invasion fleet, commanded by Admiral Takagi, departed Kendari on February 6th, escorting the Sasebo force of SNLF Marines for the conquest of Makassar. Due to Doorman's failure at the Makassar Strait, this fleet was only hindered by a US submarine, which actually managed to sink the destroyer Natsushio. Despite this, the landings proceeded according to plan on February 9th, and soon the 1,000 Dutch soldiers of Colonel Voorman were overwhelmed and forced to retreat into the jungles. The capture of Makassar marked the fall of the Celebes, where only some small guerrilla groups continued to operate. This also left the road to Java open at last, but still there was one major objective that the Japanese wanted to capture before launching their main offensive, the key airfield of Palembang in southern Sumatra. As we've covered previously, General Imamura had appointed the 38th Division of Lieutenant General Sano Tadayoshi to conduct the invasion of Sumatra. After their successful capture of Hong Kong, the division had advanced into Cam Bay by January 24th, while the 3rd Air Force had been executing air raids over Sumatra's main airfields since late December. Furthermore, Japanese forces had also occupied the Anambas Islands on January 26th to set up air bases for conducting the Sumatra and Java operations. This was because the invaders were planning to parachute a regiment of paratroopers over the key Palembang airfield, while the bulk of the 38th Division landed at Bangka Island and navigated up the Musi, Saleh and Talang rivers to support the attack on Palembang. Once Palembang was finally in Japanese hands, the invaders then planned to swiftly seize the Matapura and Tanjung Karang airfields as well as the oil installations around Talang Abab and Limau. The first landings would be carried out by a 2-battalion strong advance party that departed Cam Bay on February 9th, with the rest of the division following them 2 days later to ascend the Musi River and join the battlefield. The 38th's landings were to be supported by a strong fleet commanded by Vice Admiral Ozawa Jizaburo, mainly consisting of 6 cruisers and 11 destroyers from the 2nd Fleet and the Southern Expeditionary Fleet. On the other side, the Dutch counted with 4 territorial commands on the island of Sumatra, under the overall control of Major General Roelof Overakker. In South Sumatra in particular, Lieutenant Colonel Vogelsang had at his disposal about 2,000 men at Palembang, with a further 2 companies at Jambi, some 2,000 British reinforcements, and the support of 15 Hurricanes, 35 Hudsons, and 40 Blenheims from the RAF. Although a parachuting operation was not expected, the Dutch, led by Admiral Helfrich, were expecting a naval invasion, so Admiral Doorman's Abda striking force was ordered to Oosthaven with the objective of intercepting the invasion fleet. On February 14th, with reports of Azawa's convoy approaching southern Sumatra, Helfrich ordered Doorman to depart Oosthaven and carry out a decisive attack on the invaders. But at the same time, the Japanese paratroopers, led by Colonel Kume Seiichi, finally started dropping over the Palembang airfield, covered by elements of the 3rd Air Division. Despite the slow speed of the Japanese Ki-56 transports and the vigilant patrols of the RAF, the invaders achieved complete surprise in their paratrooper operation, aided by the dense smoke of the burned oil fields of Borneo and the Celebes. By midday, 180 men had been dropped into the airfield, with a further 90 men coming down on the oil refineries of Plajoa. While strafing the Dutch anti-aircraft defences, Japanese planes also dropped weapons, ammunition, and other equipment for the paratroopers to employ. Benefiting from the close air support, Kume's men quickly engaged and defeated waves of Dutch soldiers, inflicting heavy casualties on them and successfully capturing Plajoa's oil refineries. Yet the fighting was bitter nonetheless, with staunch resistance from the defenders that tenaciously held on to the airfield. By midnight, however, the airfield would also fall into the hands of the invaders, causing General Overakker to order a general retreat towards Oosthaven, from where they would be evacuated. At this point, the advance party of the 38th Division had also entered the Mentok anchorage, with 1 battalion heading towards Bangka Island and the rest of the party approaching the coast of Sumatra. Meanwhile, in the early hours of February 15th, bad luck struck Doorman's striking force, as the Dutch destroyer Van Gent ran aground in the Stolza Strait and was lost due to the damage suffered.
A couple of hours later, Doorman also lost the element of surprise when they were sighted by a Japanese floatplane from the cruiser Chokai.
Air attacks soon followed, with Doorman recalling the outcome of the Battle of Makassar Strait and ordering his forces to pull back. While they retreated, Japanese bombers continued to drop bombs over the Allied fleet, but at the end of the day, only minor damage would be inflicted on the Allied vessels. This was, however, Doorman's second defeat at the hands of Japanese air power, leaving the Japanese invasion fleet unimpeded to proceed with its plans. In the meantime, 60 more paratroopers were dropped over Palembang to reinforce the Japanese forces, which were conducting mopping-up operations and were consolidating their gains. While the advance party successfully seized Mentok and its airfield, and under a rain of fire and bombs dropped upon them by the RAF aircraft, then started to ascend the Musi, Teleng and Sala rivers en route to its objectives. Thus the invaders rapidly got to Palembang and successfully made contact with the paratrooper force. At this point, Kume and his men had advanced into the city of Palembang, and by nightfall, the 38th soldiers would help him secure the city. On the next day, contact would also be made with Plajoa's oil refineries, and the main strength of the 38th Division would finally arrive at the mouth of the Musi River. But meanwhile, General Sano ordered the Tanaka detachment of the advance party to advance south towards Tanjung Karang. Departing on February 17th, the Japanese quickly seized the Talang Jima oil field, but their advance was bogged down by the swamp forests of the region. By February 19th, units of the Tanaka detachment managed to capture the Martapura airfield after a minor engagement, then continued their advance with haste. That same day, the Japanese had also completed their conquest of Bangka Island, while Sano sent the Kanki detachment to capture Lahat and Bengkulu, and 1 infantry company to advance against Jambi. By dawn on February 20th, the Japanese had crossed the Manda River and had gotten to Tanjung Karang. but despite their efforts, most of the Dutch defenders had been evacuated from Oosthaven on February 17th. The invaders could only catch a glimpse of the rearguard of the defenders as they sailed away on 2 gunboats. The Tanjung Karang airfield would be captured on February 21st at long last, then being quickly put to work for air operations against Java. On this day, the Kanki detachment also departed Palembang and captured Lahat on the 22nd, Lubuk Linggau on the 23rd, and after crossing a mountain range, Bengkulu on the west coast on the 24th. Jambi would finally fall into Japanese hands on March 4th, concluding the invasion of southern Sumatra. The operation had been a huge success for the Japanese Empire, capturing several airfields and oil refineries that could further aid the war machine of the rising sun. Although most of these were in a pretty bad state, the invaders would quickly set out to repair them so that they could put them to use for the empire. The Japanese were also planning the invasions of Bali and Timor, the last of Java's Johor before the main operation of the Dutch East Indies campaign. The capture of Bali was assigned to the Kanemaru detachment, consisting of a battalion of the 48th Division under Commander Kanemaru Matabe. They had travelled to Makassar by February 15th, from where they would finally depart 3 days later, escorted by a support fleet consisting of the cruiser Negara and some 7 destroyers. Concurrently, when Admiral Helfrich discovered that the objective of the invaders was Bali, he quickly met with Doorman on February 18th and devised a very flawed plan for a counterattack. Since the vessels at the disposition of the Dutch admirals were scattered and coming from different bases, the plan was for the attack to develop in 3 stages, with each group attacking separately against what they believed was a large Japanese force. In all fairness, instead of a counterattack, this plan looked more like a raid. But despite their hastiness to stop the invasion, the Japanese had already entered the Sanur anchorage by midnight, successfully landing on Bali in the early hours of February 19th and jeopardizing the entire point of the Allied attack. Upon landing, the Kanemaru detachment headed westward under heavy rain and quickly seized the Denpasar barracks and the Kuta airfield almost without resistance. This effectively neutralized the Allied presence in Bali, and the key town of Singaraja would finally fall a week later. But on that day, while the main naval force stood by for support on the sea east of Sepanjang Island, 4 Japanese destroyers of the 8th Destroyer Division and the troop transports got attacked by a relentless aerial bombardment that hindered their efforts and damaged one of the transports. In fear of losing it, the destroyers Arashio and Michishio escorted it back to Makassar, while the destroyers Asashio and Oshio remained in the Sanur anchorage until disembarkation was completed and finally departed after dark. These 2 destroyers were about to face the first group of the ABDA striking force. Shortly before midnight, Dorman deployed his 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers on the Badung Strait, ordering the cruisers to engage with gunfire and the destroyers to then attack with torpedoes. This was a poor plan, and it was also poorly executed due to the slowness to fire of the Dutch cruisers, with one of them not even opening fire. In the ensuing firefight, the Asashio was hit on her searchlight, but she also quickly scored a hit on the cruiser Java, causing some minor damage. This prompted the Dutch cruisers to race off to the north and break contact. Afterwards, the Japanese were engaged by the Allied destroyers, which caused heavy damage on the troop transport. But the Asashio yet again saved the day, isolating the Dutch destroyer Pitane with great technique and mercilessly sinking her enemy. After the demise of the Pitane, the firefight continued, but neither side hit the other again, and in the end, the Allied destroyers escaped to the southeast. Now it was the turn of the second group, but the Japanese were to be reinforced by the Arashio and Michishio returning from Makassar. 4 destroyers and 1 cruiser entered the Badung Strait and started to fire torpedoes against the anchorage, where they believed the enemy would be. At this point, the main Japanese naval force had also been alerted, and the Negara was steaming to the area. But meanwhile, the Asashio and Oshio spotted the American destroyers and quickly engaged them in an intense firefight which saw the Stuart getting severely hit and damaged. The result was pandemonium. Parrott nearly ploughed into Stewart, which was leading the destroyers, while John D. Edwards avoided Parrott only by making a hard turn to starboard. The Japanese destroyers then shifted their attention to the cruiser Tromp, pounding the Dutch vessel and causing extensive fires. In return, Tromp scored a hit on the bridge of the Oshio and also inflicted heavy damage on her. The Asashio took a single hit forward on her bridge that killed 7 of her crew. As a result, all 3 ships then broke contact. And to the north, the Arashio and Michishio were caught by surprise by the American destroyers, suffering a deadly crossfire that caused huge damage on the Michishio. The Tromp also turned to her and scored a tremendous hit on her engine room, which caused her to stop. But before finishing the Michishio off, the Allies promptly disengaged and escaped to the northeast. 8 torpedo boats of the 3rd Group then entered the scene, but they would never get into attack position and would have to return to Surabaya without achieving anything. All in all, the small Japanese destroyer division had fended off Doorman's attack admirably and had even inflicted more casualties than the attackers, sinking 1 destroyer and severely damaging the Tromp and the Stewart, which would later have to be scuttled after an accident in a repairing dock. Yet again, Doorman failed to score a local victory against the IJN due to his poor planning and ineffectiveness. The unit appointed to execute the Timor operation was the Eastern Detachment of General Ito, which had last taken part in the invasion of Ambon. The invasion of Timor, however, had one major diplomatic problem. Rule of the island was divided between the Dutch and Portuguese colonial governments. Now in 1941, the Japanese had decided to respect the neutrality of Portugal both in Macau and East Timor, even though time would later show them aggressively exerting their influence on both colonies. But back on December 17th, after Portugal's refusal to collaborate with the Allies, 400 Allied soldiers had swiftly occupied East Timor to cover the severely exposed flank of Dutch Timor. This forced the Japanese to invade, and plans were quickly drawn out to include the Portuguese colony for the Timor operation. But with the passing of time, British and Portuguese authorities would eventually reach an agreement for the Allies to abandon the occupation of East Timor in exchange for the establishment of a strong Portuguese military force in the colony. On January 28th, this 800-man force began its long journey from Mozambique. They would, however, arrive too late to stop the invasion. The Japanese plan for the Timor operation was simple. 1 battalion of the Eastern Detachment, led by Colonel Doi Sadashichi, would land at Dili, while the rest of the detachment under Ito himself landed at Kupang. They would be joined by SNLF Marines of the Sasebo Force landing at Kupang and by paratroopers of the Yokosuka Force, also conducting a parachuting operation in the area. Finally, the invasion convoy would be escorted by a strong fleet, mainly consisting of 3 cruisers and 11 destroyers, and their efforts would be further supported by an attack on Darwin's Harbour, which was to be carried out on February 19th by almost 250 Japanese planes from 4 aircraft carriers. The ensuing bombing of Darwin was intense and savage, leaving 30 Allied aircraft destroyed, 11 vessels sunk, and 28 ships damaged, including most of the cargo shipping available to support efforts in the Dutch East Indies and the Philippines. Meanwhile, in Timor, the local garrison of Colonel Nico van Strata only had around 500 Dutch soldiers at his disposal. But immediately after the outbreak of the war, the Australians had formed the Sparrow Force to reinforce them. Lieutenant Colonel William Legat led this force of almost 1,400 men, including a company of commandos. All of the Allied forces were located around Kupang, but after the occupation of East Timor, most of the Dutch soldiers and Australian commandos were transferred to Dili. The main invasion force of General Ito departed Ambon on February 17th, with the Doi Battalion departing the following day. On the night of February 19th, both forces reached their objectives and thus commenced the invasion of Timor. The Japanese initially landed around Cape Mali on the south coast of Kupang, where the Allied defences were considered weak, and on the coast west of Dili, where they took the defenders by surprise. By midday, 308 paratroopers of the Yokosuka had also been parachuted to Babao, where they rapidly captured the town before heading to the Penfui airfield. Then, the landings proceeded as planned, as the coast was practically undefended, so the invaders hastily advanced on Kupang and Dili by the end of the day. At Dili, covered by their naval forces, the Japanese headed eastwards and directly attacked the Allied positions. Despite fierce Australian resistance, the Allied forces soon began an orderly withdrawal by February 21st, leaving the city and the airfield of Dili to the Japanese. While Van Straten and his Dutch forces headed southwest towards the border with Dutch Timor, the surviving Australian commandos would escape to the south and to the east, where they would begin guerrilla warfare from the mountainous interiors. Back at Kupang, the eastern detachment divided itself into 3 columns, with the left column advancing directly on Kupang, the centre column assaulting Australian positions at Penfui, and the right column thrusting northeast of Oasau to cut off the Allied retreat. Despite their brave and ferocious resistance, the Australians decided to withdraw east when they learnt that the invaders were racing to cut them off. The next day, as Ito's main force entered Kupang and captured the city and the Penfui airfield, Legat launched a sustained and devastating assault on the Japanese positions at Oasau, culminating with a bayonet charge where the Japanese had successfully managed to cut their retreat. Suffering dozens of losses, the invaders resisted until the night of February 22nd, when Ito's main force finally arrived to save them. Even though they were surrounded, the Australians tenaciously continued to assault the decimated Japanese positions at Oasau, eventually breaking through and escaping eastwards. But Ito's forces quickly pursued and caught them in the area east of Naibonak by the morning of February 23rd. With his forces low on ammunition, exhausted, carrying wounded men and surrounded, Legat finally decided to surrender with around 1,000 of his men. Only about 290 Australian and Dutch troops would manage to escape eastwards towards the border with East Timor. While the Japanese conducted mopping up operations around Dili and Kupang, they would later join with Van Straten's forces at the border, from where they would continue to execute guerrilla warfare. The Australian commandos under Major Alexander Spence would also continue to resist in East Timor for around a year, getting supplied by air and successfully executing ambushes on isolated Japanese groups. Thus came the end of the last of Java's terror before the main invasion. Now the stage was set for the fall of the last link in the Malay Barrier. As we have already discussed a few weeks ago, the Japanese had planned to launch a 2-pronged naval invasion of Java, to be carried out by the main strength of the 2nd and 48th Divisions. But above this was an incredibly overwhelming superiority in aerial and naval strength, with more than 600 aircraft allotted for the Java operation, and with around 4 battleships, 13 heavy cruisers, and dozens of light cruisers and destroyers approaching the Java Sea, under the overall command of Admiral Takahashi. Since February 3rd, the Japanese had launched Operation Z, a full-scale air campaign over eastern Java that resulted in severe damage inflicted on the Allied Navy and on the island's infrastructure and defences. On February 18th, the Western Force, consisting of the 2nd Division and the Shoji Detachment, departed Cam Bay with an invasion fleet of 56 transports, a large escort force of 3 cruisers and 13 destroyers, and a strong covering force that consisted of 5 heavy cruisers and several destroyers, led by Admiral Ozawa. Meanwhile, the 48th Division departed Jolo on February 19th with an invasion force of 41 transports, an escort built around Admiral Takagi's 2 heavy cruisers and 8 destroyers, and a covering force of 6 destroyers and a light cruiser. While heading towards eastern Java, the eastern force would be joined by the bulk of the Sekiguchi detachment just off Pemanakan. Takahashi also held a reserve of 2 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers north of Java, while Admiral Kondo's support force and the Kidubutai stood by to the south of Java. The Allies knew of the massing of the invasion convoys, so Admiral Helfrich quickly reacted by forming 2 strike forces, the Western Striking Force of Commodore John Collins, consisting of 5 cruisers and 6 destroyers, and the Eastern Striking Force of Admiral Dorman, which had 3 cruisers and 7 destroyers. With the Japanese Eastern Force being closer to the Allied fleet, Helfrich detached 2 cruisers and 3 destroyers of Collins's force to Dormans on February 25th, being determined to stop the Japanese invasion before it could even begin. Thus Helfrich's plan was for Dorman to defeat the Japanese eastern force, and then to head to the west to also defeat the western force. Yet the Allies didn't even know the exact location of the Japanese fleet, and so on the night of February 25th, Dorman took his force out to make a sweep around Madoera Island, before returning unsuccessfully to Surabaya. The next day, the location of the invaders was discovered, and Dorman departed by afternoon with 6 destroyers as his vanguard. His unimaginative plan was to attack with this vanguard while the cruisers engaged targets from a distance and the remaining destroyers executed a torpedo attack afterwards. In the early hours of February 27th, the Allied force reached the Sapuedi Strait, but found no trace of the invaders. By midday, just when he was about to turn back, the Allies reported that the Japanese invasion force was just 80 kilometers north of Surabaya. Dorman then rushed back to port, while Takagi headed to Kragan to land the Sakaguchi detachment. At this point, the Japanese already knew that the Allied fleet was coming, so Takagi was concentrating his forces while heading westwards. During the afternoon, while the landings proceeded according to plan, Dorman's fleet arrived in 3 columns and quickly spotted the westernmost Japanese group around 1600 hours. At the same time, the Japanese spotted them, and the cruiser Jinsu began the battle by firing at the destroyer Electra 16 kilometers away. Takagi's 2 heavy cruisers also started to fire, and Dorman's cruisers promptly responded, but the exchange was very ineffective. For the next 30 minutes, the 2 forces continued westwards on parallel courses, something that was to the advantage of the Japanese, who held a secret weapon in reserve, the long-range Type 93 torpedo. The range from which the Japanese destroyers were going to fire was something that the Allies definitely didn't expect. At a distance of almost 14 kilometers, the 4th Squadron of Rear Admiral Nishimura Shoji was the first to launch its deadly torpedoes at Dorman's fleet. Starting around 1635 and lasting for 40 minutes, the Japanese fired a total of 39 torpedoes, disappointingly only hitting the destroyer Courtineer at 1713, which broke in 2 and quickly sank as a result. As the firefight started, Dorman knew that he needed to close the distance between the 2 forces so that he could bring into play the 6-inch guns aboard his cruisers. Eventually, Japanese effectiveness also began to increase, with a shell hitting Houston at 1706. Although the invaders only destroyed the Courtineer, the Allied force was thrown into chaos. The Exeter was then hit by gunfire, causing extensive damage and forcing the cruiser to turn to port to avoid a collision with the cruisers behind it. Mistaking Exeter's retreat as a general retreat, the Allied cruisers promptly disengaged and started to turn back, causing disarray in the Allied force. Around 1730, Dorman finally re-established control over the Allied cruisers and turned back to the northeast. But he only found Takagi waiting to launch another massive torpedo attack, since the Japanese had reconnaissance planes flying over to gather intel on Dorman's state. The barrage totaled an amazing 98 torpedoes, yet incredibly none of them hit their target. Around 1800, the British destroyers then counterattacked against Rear Admiral Tanaka Rezio's 2nd Squadron, causing light damage to the Jinsu and to the destroyer Asagumo. But the Japanese quickly returned fire and achieved a great hit on the Electra, rapidly sinking the destroyer around 1815. Yet despite his losses and unfavourable situation, Dorman continued to press the attack, leading his cruisers eastwards to cover Exeter's retreat, which would later safely arrive at Surabaya. With darkness approaching, Dorman then ordered the American destroyers to lay smokescreens so that they could break contact. In their confusion, the destroyers launched a torpedo attack instead. Luckily, Takagi cautiously decided to turn back north to avoid the attack and to regroup. With Dorman retreating eastwards, the battle appeared over for Takagi, but the Dutch admiral was going to turn back to the northeast with his remaining forces, determined to eliminate the invasion convoy and save Java. As we've previously discussed, the Japanese had planned to execute two main amphibious assaults, one in Western Java to be carried out by the 2nd Division of Lieutenant General Maruyama Masao and the Shoji detachment of Colonel Shoji Toshinari, and one in Eastern Java by the main strength of Lieutenant General Tsuchihashi Yutsu's 48th Division, accompanied by the bulk of the Sakaguchi detachment. Two strong fleets escorted the Japanese convoys, which had departed their assembly points by February 19th and were near their objectives by February 27th. Meanwhile, the Dutch defended their main island with three fully equipped, albeit poorly trained divisions under the command of General Hein te Putten, totaling some 25,000 soldiers, mostly Indonesian. He divided his forces into three areas, with the 1st Division in Batavia and Western Java, the 2nd Division in Central Java, and the 3rd Division in Eastern Java. His plan was to hold on as long as possible to the three main bases at Bandung, Cilacap, and Surabaya. General Wavell had also reinforced the Dutch troops with around 6,000 British and American soldiers, while the Australians had sent the brigade-strong Black Force of Brigadier Arthur Blackburn by February 16th. Additionally, naval forces at Java were under the command of Admiral Helfrich, who had formed two strike forces to intercept and destroy the invasion fleets before they could land on the shores of Java. At the Java Sea, we left Admiral Dorman's Eastern Striking Force retreating eastwards, while Admiral Takagi regrouped his forces to the north. The battle seemed over, but with night falling, Dorman decided to press his attack, rapidly turning to the northeast with his remaining forces in a last attempt to save Eastern Java. Yet again, Japanese float planes flying over the Allied fleet immediately reported to Takagi that Dorman was moving back north, which caught the Japanese admiral off guard. He quickly tried to reassemble his dispersed forces, while two damaged destroyers of Admiral Nishimura's 4th Squadron retreated to protect the convoy. Around 1930, after spotting the Allied formation to the southeast, Admiral Tanaka's 2nd Squadron positioned itself in front of Takagi's cruisers to cover them from the incoming enemy fire. The small fire exchange was inconsequential, and thus Dorman changed course to the east, determined to get through to the transports. His intention was to get around the Japanese formation by heading towards the southern coast of Java. At 2100, he turned back to the west with his 4 cruisers and the destroyer Jupiter, while the American destroyers under Commander Thomas Binford headed back to Surabaya to refuel and load more torpedoes. Around 2130, bad luck struck Dorman once more when the Jupiter hit a Dutch mine and foundered hours later, leaving the Dutch admiral with just his 4 cruisers while he continued to the north in search of the Japanese convoy. Around 2200, Takagi also suffered some bad luck, as he lost radio contact with his float planes, leaving him blind for the first time in the battle. Desperately, he turned south, finally spotting the Allied column around 2300. While Takagi's cruisers turned north on a parallel course to Dorman's cruisers, Tanaka's squadron prepared to make a deadly torpedo attack. 10 minutes later, the Allied cruisers spotted their enemy and began the fire exchange. Around 2320, the Japanese cruisers finally launched some 12 torpedoes against the Allied formation. Despite Dorman's effort to evade the torpedo attack, his determination and his previous failures had brought him at last to his final doom. At 2336, the Java was hit, causing the aft magazine to explode. Within 15 minutes, the cruiser had sunk, with the loss of 509 sailors. 4 minutes later, the De Ruyter was also hit on her aft, suffering a large fire that engulfed the entire stern position of the ship. Powerless, the cruiser sank hours later, suffering 344 losses, among them the Dutch admiral. Taking advantage of the smoke and confusion, the Houston and Perth then changed course and escaped to the southeast, successfully arriving at Tanjung Priok the following day. This concluded the First Battle of the Java Sea, leaving ABDACOM with the loss of 2 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and one of its leading commanders. The Japanese Eastern Force was now free to continue their landings unmolested. Meanwhile, the Western Striking Force had also failed to intercept the Japanese invasion fleet. with the invaders' landings also proceeding as expected. To avoid any more losses, Helfrich was then persuaded to order a withdrawal, with most of the western force escaping through the Sunda Strait before the arrival of the Japanese. Yet by February 28th, 8 destroyers and 3 cruisers remained trapped on Java's northern shore. At dusk, the cruisers Houston and Perth, and then HNLMS Evertson departed Tanjung Priok, heading towards the Sunda Strait to escape to safety. Despite the poor Japanese initial deployment, leaving the convoys in a vulnerable position, the 5th Squadron of Rear Admiral Hara Kanzaburo managed to intercept the Allied cruisers and cover the transports with a smokescreen. Hara then attacked in a chaotic way, performing really poorly and only causing light damage to the enemy. What is worse, the Japanese torpedo attack missed the Allied cruisers and hit 4 Japanese transports and a mine layer at Bantam Bay, sinking the 5 vessels, including the one that carried General Imamura, although he managed to survive this experience. In the early hours of March 1st, the Allied cruisers were surrounded and finally hit by torpedoes, then sinking into their final resting place. The destroyer Evertson had caught up to the 2 cruisers and watched the battle from a distance and attempted to escape along the coast of Sumatra, but ended up spotted by Japanese destroyers Murakumo and Shirakumo and had to run aground. At the same time, Binford's 4 American destroyers, which had decided to escape through the narrow Bali Strait, were detected and came under fire by patrolling Japanese destroyers. The fire exchange was inconclusive though, and the destroyers successfully managed to quickly escape under the cover of smokescreens. The last of the Allied vessels were the damaged cruiser Exeter and the destroyers Pope and Encounter, arriving at the Sunda Strait in the late morning. Their desperate escape was doomed from the start, being rapidly spotted by Japanese aircraft, and so Admiral Takahashi had laid a trap for them. 4 Japanese heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers began to hunt down the Allied force, with the Pope and Encounter laying a smokescreen to protect Exeter from the incoming fire. For the first hour, the invaders failed to score any hits, yet they were continuing to close in on the Allied vessels. Despite their brave resistance, the Japanese cruisers finally scored a crippling blow on the Exeter, causing her to lose power and then sink. The Allied destroyers would also be hunted down in the next hours, with Encounter getting scuttled due to the strong Japanese fire, and with Pope also getting scuttled after an intense aerial bombardment. In the remainder of the day, 4 more Allied destroyers would get destroyed by Japanese aerial and naval attacks to the south, ending the Second Battle of the Java Sea and naval campaign in the Dutch East Indies. On land, however, the Battle of Java was merely starting. By 0400 on March 1st, and despite the friendly fire, the bulk of the 2nd Division had successfully landed around Bantam Bay, with the intention of advancing on Batavia and then Bandung, while the Shoji detachment also landed at the patrol area to capture the valuable Kelijati airfield. On the other side, the Eastern Force suffered some aerial bombardment, although this couldn't prevent the 48th Division and the Sakaguchi detachment from landing at Kragan, with the objective of taking Rembang and then the Kepu oil field before attacking Sawerabaja and Cilacap. On Bantam Bay, the 2nd Division divided itself into 3 detachments, with the Nesu detachment advancing on Rangkasbitung towards the key Buetazorch town between Batavia and Bandung, the Fukushima detachment immediately capturing Mount Merak and Merak Island before advancing on Pamarian towards Batavia, and the Satu detachment pushing along the coastal road through Bantam and Tangerang towards Batavia. Quickly and decisively, the Nasu detachment managed to overcome Dutch resistance at Merak, Cilegon and Serang before getting to Rangkasbitung by dusk. Meanwhile, from Eritan, the Shoji detachment immediately divided in 2, with 1 battalion charging against the Kelijati airfield and the other heading towards the Kwarang Bridge over the Kitarum River. Rushing towards the airfield, the Wakamatsu unit rapidly engaged the Dutch defenders, driving them off 4 times and getting to Kelijati by midday. There, the Japanese seized the airfield after overrunning the defenders and immediately started to refit it for use. Yet despite this initial success, the detachment was attacked at Eritan by 500 Dutch troops in armoured vehicles, which could only be repelled after a hard-fought struggle. The loss of Kalijetti was huge, however, and Tiportan immediately ordered counterattacks to retake it. And from Kragan, the eastern force rapidly set up to execute its operations. The Sekiguchi detachment only got to seize Blora by nightfall, but the 48th Division had one element capture Rembang, while the rest of the division headed towards Kepu and Bojonegoro. On March 2nd, the vanguard of the Nasu detachment encountered Australian gunners at Chipetang, which obstructed the road to Lewiliang. An intense fight ensued, but the invaders got the upper hand in the end and advanced up to Lawangtaji. Meanwhile, the Fukushima detachment reached the Pamarian Bridge by midnight, and the Seto detachment got to the bridge of Kragilan, successfully establishing a foothold over the Chujung River. But in Subang, the situation was desperate for the isolated Shoji detachment. 250 soldiers and 25 light tanks attacked Shoji's headquarters there and overran the Japanese positions. Yet the invaders held their ground, and after destroying 20 enemy vehicles, the Dutch attack was repelled at last. At the same time, Sekiguchi captured the towns of Purudadi and Nyawen, while the 48th Division easily defeated a Dutch unit and occupied Kepu and its already destroyed oil field. The Japanese got to the Bojonegoro Bridge as well, but found it destroyed due to delaying actions on behalf of the Allies. The following day, however, the invaders had crossed the Solo River and started to engage some defenders on the other side, while the Sekiguchi detachment also seized Bugel and prepared for an attack against Surakata. In the meantime, Shoji and the Wekimetsu unit prepared to brace for another Dutch counterattack with armoured vehicles. The Japanese put up a good fight, but the difference was made by the aircraft flying from the Kalijetti airfield, which managed to destroy over 150 Dutch vehicles and cause over 100 Dutch casualties. At this point, fearing encirclement, Shoji decided to prepare for an attack on Bandung, and to call back the units advancing towards Kwarang to instead traverse through better roads from Kalijetti. Moreover, upon reaching Lewiliang, the vanguard of the Nasu detachment went into battle with the main strength of Black Force, which managed to hold the invaders' advance from their entrenched pillboxes, while both the Fukushima and Seto detachment arrived to the Chidurian River, capturing the bridges at Maja and Parigi. Seeing no roads from Maja, Fukushima would then be ordered to support Nasu's rear, while Seto's vanguard also advanced and captured the town of Balaraja on the next day, getting ever closer to Batavia. In the early hours of March 4th, knowing that they had to break through Lewiliang to save Shoji, the main strength of the Nasu detachment joined the fight against Black Force. Thus, the 16th Regiment was ordered to execute a flanking maneuver to the south, while the rest of the detachment contained the Australians with fire. Under the cover of darkness, the 16th crossed the Chenten River and charged against the positions of an Australian company. Black Force gave a tenacious resistance, inflicting many casualties on the invaders, but in the end, the Australians would get surrounded, and Blackburn would order a withdrawal. While they retreated during the night, the same would be done by the Dutch holding on in Batavia. And in Kalijetti, the success of the Japanese resistance had allowed the Wakamatsu unit to capture Purukata. The Egashira unit had also managed to turn around, getting to Chikampek with haste and arriving at Kwarang after defeating several Dutch units. They then pursued the retreating Dutch soldiers to Kedungade, where the Egashira unit stopped its advance. Having achieved all his initial objectives, and recognizing that the enemy was concentrating his forces, Shoji then decided to fully commit to an attack against Bandung instead of waiting to suffer another massive counterattack, enjoying the support of the mighty 3rd Air Division. Turning back to the east, we find that Sekiguchi finally concentrated his 3 battalions on Purodadi by afternoon, and then launched his attack on Surikata. They would arrive at the town by early morning on March 5th, charging against the meager Dutch defenders and capturing the town by midday. Meanwhile, Sekiguchi's vanguard would also capture Boyolali and, sensing the weakness in the Dutch defences, continued towards Yogyakarta, seizing the town by dusk. Seeing the enemy retreat without restraint, Sekiguchi then decided to closely pursue them until reaching their main objective, Jelajap. Another battalion, however, turned to Manglang, where it forced the garrison to surrender. but the garrison commander thought that this was the main Japanese force, and so ordered the towns of Semarang and Ambawara to also surrender. After occupying these towns, the battalion would then continue westwards, reaching Purbalingga on March 8th. In the meantime, the 48th Division had finally crossed the Solo River, continuing its advance towards the Brantas River on March 5th. The vanguard of the 48th, mainly consisting of the 47th Regiment and the 4th Tank Regiment, then advanced to Caruban, where they defeated a Dutch unit and pursued them with haste to Kertosono. There they engaged almost 1,000 enemy troops and managed to capture the town by midday, with another element capturing Kendari later that day. Meanwhile, important events were happening in the west. Departing Balaraja in the morning, the Satu detachment discovered that the Dutch forces were retreating, and thus advanced with haste through Tangerang and finally arrived at Batavia by dusk. During the night, the Japanese triumphantly entered the colonial capital without opposition, allowing the rest of the division to focus on Bandung. But unbeknownst to the 2nd Division, Shoji had already sent the Wakamatsu unit southwards to Chiata, where it arrived by afternoon. There, however, the invaders were engaged by tenacious defenders in pillboxes across 2 lines. At the end of the day, the pillbox positions had been successfully taken with the help of the 3rd Air Division. But on the following day, the Wakamatsu unit directly attacked the main enemy position at Chiata Pass. There, Major General Jakob Pesman had around 9,000 men, covered with jungle in strong pillboxes and barbed wire entanglements, with the mission of holding off the invaders. But taking advantage of a thick fog, the Japanese charged all at once and took the defenders by surprise, quickly routing them. At this point, if Wakamatsu decided to pursue them, he could have entered Bandung unopposed, but instead decided to wait for the Egashira unit out of sheer friendship to the battalion commander, not wanting to steal the glory he deserved as well. Back with the 2nd Division, when they received news of Shoji's attack on March 6th, the Sato detachment was immediately sent to reinforce them at Kalijati. At the same time, however, the Nasu and Fukushima detachments were encroaching on Baltazar through Dramaga, yet they found the Australians there retreating. The Japanese then charged into the town and successfully seized Baltazar. And to the east, the 48th Division continued its advance, getting to Mojokerto and sending its vanguard to charge against Porong, while the rest of the division continued towards Suarabaja. The invaders quickly broke through the Dutch defences, and by afternoon they had captured Porong. On March 7th, preparations continued for the attacks against Suarabaja and Jelajap, but the Shoji detachment would bring about the rapid conclusion of the campaign. While the Wakamatsu unit consolidated on the ridgeline and mopped up the remaining enemy units, General Pesman found his position untenable and decided to surrender. At Isola Hotel, General Imamura then demanded the total capitulation of the Dutch East Indies, something General Tepodden and the governor initially refused, claiming they didn't have that authority. But on the morning of March 8th, the Dutch commander conceded defeat at last and agreed to the capitulation of all of his troops, something that was broadcasted later on during the night. Elsewhere, the 48th Division entered Suarabaja, meeting no resistance, and Sakaguchi began his assault on Jelajap, getting to Purwokerto before receiving the Dutch surrender. Across Java and the Dutch East Indies, many Allied units that still resisted would also decide to surrender in the next few days, while others continued to execute guerrilla warfare. Only the Allied units at northern Sumatra continued to resist. Yet on this day, the Empire of the Rising Sun had achieved one of its main objectives of the Pacific War, securing a constant flow of resources for its war machine. This also marked the end of the Abda defense in the Dutch East Indies and the collapse of the Malay Barrier. The Indian Ocean and approach to Australia was now open to the IJN.
To the west, another operation was planned to mop up the remaining Allied presence in Sumatra. General Yamashita had planned to send his Imperial Guards Division to occupy central and northern Sumatra, where the Dutch were still holding after the 38th Division was finally contained at Moe Aratabo by March 2nd.
Heavy fighting ensued in the following days, but with the surrender of Java on March 8th, General Overaka decided to retreat with his remaining 9,000 soldiers to concentrate on the north of the island and thus start an evacuation. Yamashita's plan was to land one strong detachment at Sabang Island and Kutaraja, one small detachment at Idi to secure the Langsa and Pangkalan-Brandon oil fields, and the main force of the division at Labuhan Roko to rapidly occupy Medan. By March 10th, the invasion force, escorted by a large fleet under Admiral Ozawa, had departed Singapore en route to its objectives. On March 12th, one battalion of the Kobayashi detachment landed on Sabang unopposed and rapidly seized the island, while the remaining 2 battalions landed at Cape Pedro and quickly captured the Kotaraja airfield. Further to the south, the Yoshida detachment landed south of Idi and captured its objectives facing no resistance. And at Tanjung Tiram, General Nishimura sent 2 battalions south to cut off the withdrawal of the Dutch defenders, while the rest of his division drove north to seize Medan and its airfield. At this point, the Dutch were already retreating to their designated positions south of the Alice Valley, so they would only execute delaying actions to gain as much time as possible, alongside destroying their airfields and harbour facilities along the way. On the night of March 13th, 3 Dutch companies at Simpang Raja were assaulted by Japanese soldiers. The defenders held until dawn, but in the end had to retreat in disorder towards Tiga Roengu. Unfortunately, they found the Japanese already there, and were eventually routed by the superior Japanese firepower. The invaders would then overrun the Dutch defenders at Prapat, Posia and Baligay, hastily pursuing the survivors to Quetta Bulabenteng and successfully occupying Sibarongbarong. Thus, the Dutch soldiers that were retreating from Moraratabo were effectively cut off and had to surrender on March 15th. In the meantime, Nishimura's main force swiftly seized Medan without opposition, and then started to raid the Dutch positions at Tiga Benanga for the next couple of days. By March 23rd, Quetta Bulabenteng was under heavy attack and in grave danger of being overrun, so Overaka ordered a general evacuation towards Liang before this position was captured. As night fell, the Japanese attacked Quetta Bulabenteng, but the fierce Dutch defenders managed to hold them off. Yet despite their bravery, many natives in the Dutch army were beginning to desert, and the state of Aceh began to rebel against Dutch rule, so Overaka quickly ordered them to start their withdrawal on the night of March 21st, while the rest of his forces fell further back towards the Alice Valley. Nishimura followed suit in hot pursuit, and captured Kotajane on March 25th, but the Dutch were receiving more damage by the amount of desertions. By March 27th, the Kobayashi detachment had reached the Dutch headquarters at Blancajaran, which was virtually undefended, so Overaka had no other choice but to surrender with his remaining 2,000 soldiers the following day. The fall of Java back in early March signified the end of organised resistance in the Indies, but there were still small garrisons or guerrilla groups operating on some of the islands. One of these places was Dutch New Guinea, which up until now hadn't been attacked by the invaders. A small navy unit of up to 1,500 men was formed on March 15th to annihilate Dutch resistance in New Guinea and occupy the strategic points of that island. On March 29th, this unit departed Ambon towards Seram Island, escorted by a small fleet under Rear Admiral Fujita Ruitaro. 2 days later, it first landed on Boila without opposition, finding the oil field there completely destroyed. From there, the invaders moved to Fafak, Babo and Sorong, again finding very little resistance. They then headed north, diverting to occupy Ternate and Jailolo on April 7th, before continuing eastwards. On April 12th, the Japanese finally got to Manokwari, where they forced the 150 defenders to retreat into the mountains. A small garrison was left on Manokwari, while the bulk of the invasion force continued eastwards. By April 20th, the Japanese had gotten to Yapen Island and Hollandia, encountering almost no opposition at any of the ports that they moved through. Thinking that the Dutch had an insignificant strength on the island, Fujita then decided to return to Ambon with his force, leaving only the small garrisons already established on Dutch New Guinea.
After the nominal capture of Dutch New Guinea, final mop-up operations called for the invasion of the Lesser Sunda Islands in May. On May 8th, from Suerabaja, Admiral Haja led a task force to cover the movement of the 1st Yokosuka SNLF and of the 3rd Battalion 47th Regiment. They successfully landed the following day on the Lombok and Sumbawa Islands without encountering enemy resistance. Then the Flores Islands were occupied in quick succession over the following days, all without opposition. By May 25th, the Japanese considered Operation S a success, with the 1st Yokosuka SNLF broken up into several groups to assume the occupation of Bali, Lombok, Sumbawa, Sumba and Flores. In late July, as General Terauchi wanted to expand the perimeter towards the Arafura Sea, the 24th Special Base Force of Rear Admiral Hatakeyama Koichiro was prepared to invade the Tanimbar Islands group. Departing Ambon on July 28th, under the cover of a combined task force, the Japanese naval forces would be able to successfully occupy the Aru, Babar and Tanimbar Islands, facing little opposition by the end of the month. Yet on the Kai Islands, the invaders would be repelled by the small Dutch garrison. Despite an unsuccessful Australian attempt to reinforce these islands, the Japanese would then launch a second attack against Kai on July 30th, this time successfully driving the Dutch defenders into the jungle, where they continued to fight for another few days until some of the survivors managed to escape by a sailing boat to Australia. With the capture of these islands, the whole Dutch East Indies was left under the control of the Japanese Empire, except for the town of Merauke in the far south of New Guinea, which remained under Dutch hands, and would later be reinforced by the Australian Merauke force by the end of the year. After the construction of an airfield there, the town became so important that the Allies would reinforce Merauke with the whole 11th Australian Brigade during the first half of 1943, thus seeing the garrison expand to around 4,200 personnel, including 3,500 troops. With the conquest of the Indies, Japan had seized coveted petroleum production and refining capacity, as well as other strategic raw materials, although these facilities were largely destroyed. Nonetheless, the Japanese managed to restart extraction and refining relatively quickly, with Palembang alone accounting for 78% of Japan's aviation fuel consumption and 22% of crude oil. The transport of extracted and refined petroleum to Japan turned out to be a bottleneck, however, as Japan lacked a tanker fleet with sufficient capacity. Furthermore, the US submarine offensive and aircraft attacks played havoc among the Japanese tanker fleet, so the Empire ended up continuing the war, suffering from an extreme shortage of fuel. During this campaign, the Japanese recorded 671 soldiers killed, while the Allies suffered a combined 2,384 killed and over 40,000 captured, mostly Dutch personnel. On the naval side, the Allies lost 29 ships in total, suffering between 5,000 and 10,000 Navy personnel dead. The Americans lost the heavy cruiser Houston, the destroyers Edsall, Stewart, Pope, Peary and Pillsbury, the gunboat Asheville, the old carrier Langley, and the oiler Pecos. Meanwhile, the Dutch lost the cruisers Java and De Ruyter, the destroyers Evertsen, Kortner, Piet Hein, Van Gent, Van Ness and Witte de With, the submarines O-16, O-20, K-13, K-6 and K-7, and the coastal defence ship De Zeven Provinciën. And finally, the British lost the heavy cruiser Exeter and the destroyers Electra, Encounter, Jupiter and Stronghold, and the Australians lost the light cruiser Perth. On the other hand, the Japanese lost only the destroyers Netsushio and Sagiri, 2 minesweepers, 1 mine layer and several troop transports. Following the fall of Java, the Japanese began their occupation of the Dutch East Indies. As a result, European influence in the Indies was almost completely nullified, which also served to fuel the Indonesian independence movement. As such, Dutch administrators who expected to be kept in place to run the colony were in turn sent to detention camps. With the collaboration of the Indonesian ruling class, Japanese or Indonesian replacements were instead installed in senior and technical positions. This cooperation would allow the Japanese military government to focus on securing the large archipelago's waterways and skies, using its islands as defense posts against any Allied attacks. But on the other hand, the Japanese would be reluctant to grant independence to Indonesia or to allow the natives to participate politically, as they saw this region and its natural resources as vital to the survival of their empire. To administer this important region, the Japanese consequently divided the Indies into 3 regions: Sumatra under the 25th Army, Java and Madura under the 16th Army, and Dutch Borneo and eastern Indonesia under the 2nd Southern Expeditionary Fleet based at Makassar. The prisoners of war, which included around 40,000 troops and 100,000 civilians, were partly employed outside Java on many projects. including the construction of airfields on the island of Flores, the construction of railway lines in Burma Siam or on Sumatra, and work in mines in Japan. Due to bad conditions and Japanese brutality, about 25,000 prisoners would die during this period. The Japanese, greeted as liberators, also inflicted a heavy toll on Indonesia's population. Tens of thousands of Indonesians were to starve, work as slave laborers, or be forced from their homes. Hunger is said to have killed 2.5 million Indonesians, and Japan also employed a large number of Javanese as forced laborers. Some of these Romusha were employed on a temporary basis, but it is estimated that between 160,000 and 200,000 were deployed outside Java, many of whom died in the process. Javanese and European girls were also recruited as comfort women, subjected to mistreatment, prostitution, and rape in the military brothels. In particular, the Japanese brought Javanese girls to British Borneo as comfort women to be raped by Japanese officers at the Ridge Road School and the Basel Mission Church, as well as in stations in Kota Kinabalu, Balikpapan, and Beaufort. This sparked resistance in the Indies, such as Sultan Syahir's student underground organization and Emir Syarifuddin's left-wing underground groups. Both Sultan and Emir would later become the first two prime ministers of an independent Indonesia. Additionally, the Achenese ulama, who had revolted against the Dutch during the Japanese invasion of Sumatra, also revolted against the invaders in November of 1942. The revolt was led by the All Aceh Religious Scholars Association and was centered around the Chut Pliang village religious school. During this conflict, Japanese troops armed with mortars and machine guns were attacked by sword-wielding Achenese students under the leadership of Tengku Abdul Jalil. The Japanese suffered 18 dead in the uprising, while over 100 Achenese were killed, with the school and village mosque being burnt to the ground. Another important incident occurred between September 1943 and early 1944 when the infamous Kempai Tide police orchestrated a mass arrest of Chinese, Malay elites, Javanese, Manadonese, Dayaks, Bugis, Bataks, and Minangkabau in Kalimantan, including all of the Malay sultans, accusing them of plotting to overthrow Japanese rule, and then massacring all of them. The Japanese falsely claimed that all of those ethnic groups were involved in a plot to overthrow the Japanese and create a People's Republic of West Borneo under the Sultan of Pontianak, Sharif Muhammad al-Qadri. As such, the sultans of Pontianak, Sambas, Ketapang, Suekidana, Simpang, Quebuay, Nyabang, Sangao, Sekadao, Tajan, Sintang, and Mempawa were all executed by the Japanese, as well as up to 25 relatives of al-Qadri. The only male relative of al-Qadri not to be beheaded by the Japanese was also imprisoned in Java and would live to become the heir of the Pontianak Sultanate, under the name of Sharif Hamid II. The Japanese extermination of the Malay elite of Pontianak paved the way for a new Dayak elite to rise in its place, which would later revolt against the Japanese in 1945. Meanwhile, as the war progressed and Japan began to suffer defeats, the 16th Army in Java became more favorable to the idea of Indonesian involvement in the governance of Java. A central advisory board was therefore established, headed by pre-war independence figure Sukarno, with Indonesians appointed as advisors. In October of 1943, the Japanese also established a volunteer force called the Defenders of the Homeland to defend against a future Allied invasion. In September of 1944, Japan finally declared that it would grant Indonesia independence in the near future. Consequently, Sukarno and fellow independence activist Muhammad Hatta were granted funds to tour the archipelago, and a free Indonesia dormitory was established to prepare youth leaders for an independent Indonesia. In August of 1945, Japan went a step further and promised independence, with members of the older political generation, such as Sukarno and Hatta, joining a committee to prepare for independence and draft a constitution. And yet, the war would end before they were given the chance, so Sukarno would have to declare Indonesian independence 2 days after the Japanese surrender. Indonesian forces would then spend the next 4 years fighting the Dutch for independence, marking the twilight of the Dutch colonial empire. But this is the end for now. We shall speak more about the war in Southeast Asia in the future, but we hope that you've enjoyed this long video and the additions about the Japanese occupation. More long-form videos and more videos on the Pacific War are on the way, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our patrons and YouTube members can watch more than 200 exclusive videos. Join their ranks via the link in the description or by pressing the join button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.